Well, hi there, and welcome to week 6 of the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. I am your co-host, Kathy Bruce, and this podcast features a series of my conversations with author Geri Scazzero, based upon her book, The Emotionally Healthy Woman. And if you were with us last week, we talked about quit blaming. And this week, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, quit overfunctioning. And so now I would love to introduce to you Geri Scazzero. How are you doing, Geri?
I am doing very good. I became a grandmother again yesterday. So
Yay!
we're in the thralls of that, relieved and also really grateful.
Wonderful. And this wasn't your first, right? Was this your first grandchild?
Now this is our third grandchild. Yep.
Amazing.
It never gets old. It never gets old.
No, and I got to hear a little bit of the amazing birth story. We won't go into that with our listeners today, but what a beautiful story, and just so excited for you and Pete. That's incredible.
Thank you.
Well, we are on one of my favorite topics, and as I was telling listeners, Geri, earlier, that I like this chapter because it's one of my most difficult topics to deal with in my own life. And what we're looking at today is session 6 of quit overfunctioning. And I'm suspecting many of our listeners are going to really relate to this chapter as well. So we're gonna dive right in. And Geri, one of the things that you say in the chapter about overfunctioning is that we overfunction when we do for others what they can do for themselves. And you use this great example of in the Bible where Martha and Mary, are having Jesus over for a meal. And you talk about Martha as a great example of what an overfunctioner could look like, and how she kind of confuses caring about someone with having to take care of them. And I was thinking about this, as it relates to, how we're kind of taught the way of Jesus, and how we're taught in the church, it's the right thing to take care of one another. And I was thinking, well, isn't this what Jesus did? I mean, isn't that what we're supposed to do, is take care of people?
I'd say yes and no, because it really depends on how you define caring for one another. And I mean, Jesus deeply, deeply cared about people. I don't think he cared. I don't think he took care of every need that came across. I don't know. I don't have to say, I don't think he did not take care of every need that came across his path. Jesus actually said no a lot. I mean, a lot. He turned away the crowds often enough. He'd say to his disciples, we need to get out of here. We need to go off and be by ourselves now. So he was, turning away people. I think Jesus is such a model for us of respecting his limits. And I love to say that in order to actually be able to say a healthy yes, you have to be able to say a healthy no. And so Jesus could say a healthy no. Now, in terms of Martha and Mary, it's an amazing story. And the picture that Rembrandt paints, anyway, is, if you look at Martha, the one who's doing all the caring, so to speak, and I, as one who totally relates to Martha, I am a classic overfunctioner like you. I mean, this is my Achilles heel, continues to be. But Martha's miserable. She's pretty miserable in that picture, in that story. And so, yeah, she's running around. But those of us that are Marthas can, totally relate and say she has a right to be upset with her sister. Her sister's sitting there doing nothing. But Martha has gone beyond caring about people or caring for people, whatever. Who knows why she's doing what she's doing, but she's miserable. And it's really not true care, which actually brings us to one of the really important things to think about in terms of caring for others. I think there's two issues. One is motives. A lot of our caring for other people is really self-serving. If you look at your heart of hearts, we care for people sometimes because we can't say no, or we're afraid of their response if we don't do what they want us to do or meet their need or what they expect. So sometimes our motives have fear in them, have control, need for control in them, or how I'm going to look if I don't do this. So actually, a lot of our caring flows from a self-serving place, and that's
Wow.
yeah, that's not. There's just nothing good or healthy about that.
No, I mean, that's not really true caring.
Exactly, exactly, and a lot flows from that. But also the other issue when you talk about caring for others, because you're right, Kathy, it's a big issue in the church
Hmm.
because it's actually the place where we get um, we get rewarded for something that's not always looks healthy on the outside, but it's not necessarily healthy.
Right.
But the other thing besides motive is you got to respect your human limits. We
Yeah.
cannot care for everybody, and I think in that case, Jesus was a great model.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the connection there between the limits, being able to say a healthy no is definitely a huge struggle, and one that I don't feel like the church we've done a good job teaching how to do that in our discipleship, is teaching others how to respect their own limits.
Oh, yeah, but if you begin to model it, people will pick up on it. I'll tell you.
That
If it-
is true. That is
It's
true.
when you start saying no to people, again, they're like, oh, oh,
Well, it gives
oh,
them permission. It gives
yes,
them permission. So yeah,
it
I
is.
agree with that. Modeling it is definitely a
It,
huge help.
it is.
Well, I want to shift it just a little bit to some other things you talk about. Specifically, you had mentioned this overfunctioning thing has been your Achilles heel, as it has been mine. And so I was curious, is when you started to make the shift away from overfunctioning with your own family, and you got some pushback. You mentioned in the book that you stayed resolute and calm. And as I read this, I was like, wow, like that's pretty amazing. I mean, especially like I know in my own life, like getting pushback from my family, it's very difficult for me to stay calm. And so I would just was curious as to how are you able to do that and continue to follow through with the changes? And then also, how long did it take for you to see some progress in this area?
Yeah. Well, whenever I think of something being difficult to do, I think of though, what's the alternative?
Hmm.
And the alternative is usually always worse. And so um, when I think about the alternative to not over functioning, uh, the alternative to not quit over functioning means I'm going to continue being resentful, exhausted, probably depression, angry at those around me. There's just no good fruit really from over
Right.
functioning. And I'm in the end, I'm not helping those around me. I'm really not. And so whenever I think about something being difficult, like, okay, what's the alternative? Then that spurs me into action and gives me strength. And I also, though, I got strength from the fact that I expected the pushback.
Mm,
I expected
okay.
it. People do not like change. I don't like change necessarily. And my family didn't like change. Pete didn't like change. The kids didn't like the change that was happening. And I could appreciate that. But again, I had my eyes on the prize, and which was this is not against them. Actually, this is for them and it's for me.
Right.
And everybody is going to be healthier and better as a result of it. I also had learned the power of healthy no's, and also recognizing that when I'm not saying no to them, respecting my limits when I ought to be, I am not living in reality. I am not living in truth. So I'm not living in true Christian love. I wanted to be an authentic Christian, but
Mm,
when I'm over functioning, I am not living into authentic Christian living.
mm,
And again, you may appear nice on the outside when you're saying yes all the time,
right.
but that's probably you're probably not looking nice on the inside.
Right. Well,
And
and you talk about also the fact that when we overfunction, it creates underfunctioning in other people. And so I was thinking about this like in my own family. it's been difficult, as my son has entered into the teenage years, and we may have some listeners on here who are living through the teenage years as well.
Right.
It's been hard. I mean, like, just even getting him to clean his room and shifting from doing it for him to now he's 15, he's old enough to do it himself. But that was kind of why I asked, how long did it take in your family to see the progress? Because I know for me, there have been so many times where I've just wanted to give up, right? And just go and do it for him because he's still not doing it. So did it take like years and years? um,
No, no, not at all. I mean, I would begin to, even if I didn't see results in them, I saw results in me.
mm, okay.
I was a happier person, um, and even proud of myself. But I always held on to that again, this wasn't just for me. It was as important for them. And so no, I don't believe it. I don't remember it taking long. I just remember it taking courage,
Mm,
courage and lots of courage, because you're going against behavior you've had for eons.
mm,
You're trying to change a behavior that's really, I say it's almost addictive.
yeah.
It feels like an addiction to keep stepping out and overfunctioning. If you're an overfunctioner, you're doing it like the air you breathe.
Mm, yeah. So it's just becomes part of your habits. It's
It's
just
become, yes. And
very difficult to break.
very difficult to break. But once you break it, and again, realize you're not going to die, and actually, there's so many benefits to it, so much fruit to it, it just spurs you on.
Yeah. And I think, the link you talked about earlier about linking it to control, that for me is one of the biggest problems because I'm such a control freak. I'm constantly battling the need for control. So in my mind, going back to my son's room analogy, if I don't go in there and do it for him, and there's dishes that have been in there for, food,
And mold, yeah.
New York City apartment, I'm thinking roaches, I'm thinking, the whole thing. But it's like if I give up and I just keep doing it for him, he never learns the
Right.
responsibility. And so is that really the loving thing to do? No,
And
it's
yeah, and there's layers there. Not only are you doing something for him that he can and should be doing for himself, but then you also then have to face the second wave of him being angry with you or
mm,
upset with you. And that's another whole issue, is dealing with people's reactions to your staying, steadfast in your decision to not over
resolute and calm.
resolute and calm. That's right. Because then you have to deal with this scenario of, as I illustrate in the book, okay, my daughter doesn't wake up. I'm not going to wake her up. I tell her she's got to get herself up now. But what if she oversleeps?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I have a whole different set of problems, and she's going to miss the school bus. Then I have another whole. So you do have
These are my fears, Geri.
Yes, but you do have to face each one of them. So there are
Mm,
sometimes layers involved. But I just kept going through the layers, whether it was they're not getting up, they may miss a school bus, they're going to be very late, they're going to be very angry with me. Or Pete, okay, it's his turn to pick up the kids from school. Oh, he's going to forget. He does forget. And he's calling me, and I said, no, I'm not going to pick them up. So they have to sit in the principal's office. And he even calls our friend. Can you pick them up? And if she wants to overfunction for him, that's her issue. But I did have to stay resolute
wow.
and deal with and not take on other people's anxiety. So
Right.
read the chapter. It's life changing. It's important, and everybody benefits.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of these pitfalls that can happen, when we overfunction. You mentioned just a couple we can have time to talk about here, but you mentioned when we're overfunctioning in service to others. And I think again about, in the church, how we serve others. But when we're overfunctioning in service to others, that we can often underfunction for ourselves, which is fascinating. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Absolutely. Oh, and what's really interesting? Over functioners realize at some point, they're over functioning when you have symptoms of, like, again, resentfulness, exhaustion, depression, whatever. And then you want others to overfunction for you for overfunctioning.
Mm,
Like, you're right,
mhm.
like, and you're upset with others that they're not overfunctioning.
Right,
You
right.
and we want God. We want God to overfunction for us. So it's really a vicious cycle. But I found out that I was using up a lot of energy over functioning for others, and I was missing that energy for what God was calling me to do. Like, I have, each one of us has a unique calling in our life. And there isn't a lot of time or energy to contemplate that or pay attention to that if you're over functioning for others. And I know women who have actually went on to have another child when their first child went on to school, because they said to themselves, what am I going to do with my life now? What am I going
Wow.
to do? Because they're so used to serving others, giving to others. It is it can be petrifying to have this empty space, because we're not used to thinking about ourselves, thinking
Mm,
about, now, what am I going to do with my life? But
right.
your life is as important as everybody's life around you. And you get to think about that. And it's important that you have energy to think about that. But if we're over functioning for others, we are very likely under functioning in our own life for ourselves.
Wow. I mean, just what you just said about how our life is just as important as others. That's I mean, that's such an important thing, I think, for us to really not just hear but really internalize.
Absolutely.
Because we're giving up, we may be sacrificing things that God's not asking us to sacrifice
Absolutely.
to do
You
that.
and you will get so much clearer vision when you are putting energy into uh how what God is, energy into thinking through your life, your gifts, your potentials, your limits, and how God wants you to use and spend your unique life. It's very, very, very important in order for you to love others well.
Yeah. So, how have you? That's a little about how the overfunctioning can cause us to underfunction for ourselves. But I'm also wondering, how does overfunctioning destroy a community? Because you talk a little bit about this in the chapter as well. How have you seen that
Oh,
manifest?
absolutely. I mean, I can just, an example again with myself was, as a classic overfunctioner, I would um, have, for example, I might have a Bible study in my home or some kind of group in my home, and I would get the group together. I would do the study. I would host. I would set my house up. I would serve the snack. I'd set up the room. I mean, I just did everything. And I had no idea how much I was hurting the group by trying to do everything. And, each one of us have our unique reasons as to why we overfunction. And mine goes back to not wanting to impose on others. Yours, you said
Mm,
one of your things was like the need to control. And I'm
mhm,
sure I have some of that too. But the root of mine is not wanting to impose on others.
hmm,
And so, in the name of fear, again, at the root of over functioning is fear, for whatever reason, which is the opposite of the gospel, right?
right.
And loving. But I it really hurts community, because I think I'm not utilizing everybody's gifts in the group. I'm not an island. And so it really, I like the word, it distorts community. It's
Hmm,
not it's not true community if one person is doing more than everybody else. And that's not about the everybody else sitting around. It's real, if you are over functioning, you are the problem. And I'm going to say that again. If
hmm,
you are over functioning, you are the problem. Not Martha was really upset with Mary.
yeah.
Why? And I've been very upset with people. Why aren't they doing anything? They don't have to do anything, because I'm over functioning for them.
Because you're
I
doing
mean,
all of it.
where it's true, wherever you find an over functioner, you'll always find an under functioner. That's the rule of
Mhm,
if over functioners have under functioners, and the over functioner is the one that must change. That's the painful truth. The over functioner is the one that has to change the system or the way of relating, because under functioners have it wonderful in a sense, not really, but why should they change?
Right.
You're
They
doing
don't need
everything.
to.
They don't need to.
Yeah.
So it's so important. Other people aren't getting to use their gifts. Other people aren't getting the joy of doing their service. They're not exercising their muscle gifts. They're underdeveloped. Community's distorted, and you've got a person overfunctioning in the community that's upset with the other people. I mean, it's just an unhealthy scenario, and so community can never thrive with us overfunctioners.
Mm, mm,
So it's another reason I have to break my script that says don't impose on others. You know,
right. Right.
it's just not true.
Right. And so would you say that's similar to like just not being able to ask for help from others?
Yes, very similar.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, one of my favorite parts in the workbook
Mm-hmm.
was with the book comes the workbook, and you do a study, and it's really important. There's that part in the workbook where you have to make a chart of all the reasons that I overfunction. And there's many to see we're all unique.
Mm-hmm.
And we all overfunction. Even for me as a follower of Christ, to sit in, why am I overfunctioning in this context right now? And what what could I do differently? So you have to in the workbook, we force people to kind of think through, okay, why am I overfunctioning? And then what's the remedy for that? For example, why am I afraid to impose on others?
Right.
And the remedy is, well, first of all, change the script that's a fallacy that I'm imposing on others. I get to ask help, and then they get to say yes or no. To actually automatically think that I'm imposing on others is just faulty thinking.
Right.
And so when you do this in community, when each of you are sitting around in a group listing your reasons for overfunctioning, sometimes people go, I have no idea what the remedy is. I haven't a clue. They really don't, because they've been doing it for so long. But then in community, in that small group, we get to other people have no problem with, oh, well, and they can change the script for you. They can adapt the script for you. And it's like lights come on, light bulbs come on. And that's healthy community.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. I love just the imagery too of, as I think through, how this functions in the church, right? Is that this idea that the body of Christ, we have all these different parts, right, that are supposed to be working together. And so if you've got just a few, and this is unfortunately so prevalent in so many churches where you have a few doing all the things, right? And then you have all these other people sitting on the peripheral, on the outskirts, and it's not necessarily because they want to be, but they've just never been asked. They've never been asked to come into the inner and, and use their gifts in a way.
And somebody has that gift of asking. I mean, it's still really hard for me to ask for help, it's really hard. Now, my husband has the gift of asking. he has zero qualms about asking people. And as a result, I see how he gathers, and it just amazes me. So I don't want to discourage people that it's easy,
right,
but it's worth it.
Right.
It's worth it to break through and adapt our scripts and change our faulty thinking.
Yeah. And that speaking of just like this idea of like breaking free, you talk about this. You have a header actually in the chapter that says breaking free from overfunctioning. And so this idea of how easily we can become trapped in it. And we're gonna sort of at the end of the podcast, we're gonna talk a little bit about applying some of these things and how you can even find out if you're an overfunctioner. But how hard would you say is it? I mean, you're saying it can be a challenge, but where did you actually see real freedom? I don't know if you've got an example you could share or of something, but you said like the light bulbs start going on when you realize you're doing it. But how hard is it to break free from this?
I think the first, if you want to call it a step or phase of breaking free in anything, is admitting it. Like when you just even you feel the chains fall off in just admitting something about yourself, becoming aware of something that you weren't aware of, or you were resisting or warding off, there is so much freedom in admitting.
Mm,
And I would say that's one of the first biggest steps and challenges, is just admitting. Because once you admit, you can do something about it.
right.
But if you're not admitting, you stay stuck.
Yeah.
And then you can get this, there's tools and skills, ways of doing things that then that can help us to go forward. So in the example of overfunctioning, okay, wow, I am an overfunctioner. A lot I do for others what they can and should do for themselves, and recognizing that's driven by certain fears of imposing, fears of they won't do it as good as I will,
Hmm.
or whatever. And so, but then is learning how to approach people, and saying healthy no's, and dealing with people's reactions. So yeah, that's what we call unleashing the earthquake. Because
Yeah.
okay, now you've admitted it to yourself, but now you're going to actually take a step and admit it to others by saying healthy no's, or whatever, and expecting the pushback, because nobody really likes when the system changes or the
Hmm.
relationship changes. It's a jolt. People aren't, but they'll get used to it. They'll adapt. You're helping them grow up, and you're modeling well. And as you stand firm, or as you have repeated my phrase, calm and resolute.
Resolute.
Yes, calm and resolute.
Yeah. And it just, this is so good because I think, when you talked about just the admission of it, even before that, having the self awareness that you are an overfunctioner. And I was thinking about just my own family of origin. I was curious, do you see a pattern in family of origin with overfunctioning?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I learned over functioning, and you probably did too,
I,
you
I
know?
know. I was just sitting here thinking, I'm pretty sure that comes from some of my family of origin.
Yeah, even now, we're taking care of, we're surrounding my mother, who's 95, with lots of, elder care from us, from her children. She doesn't have other people, and I can see my siblings over functioning, and I'm not stepping in to save them, but I do raise the conversation continually with them. Listen, anytime that you are feeling this is beyond your limits, you need to tell us, because we can hire someone. We can hire
Hmm.
someone. But and I don't know if they're being truthful or not, but that's kind of,
Right.
but Pete had the same thing when he was taking care of his mother. Actually, well, she was dying. He was dying because
Hmm.
he was over functioning. I mean, she lived closer to us. He was doing a lot of the work of caring for her. And he finally, with some good mentoring of someone who was ahead of him in that, said, listen, you have to gather your siblings together. You
Mm.
have to let them know of the situation. And you have to say that you are no longer going to, you can no longer overfunction in this way, and that they all need to bring their resources to bear
Right.
in some way so that we can care for her together. But that was a very big conversation, a very adult conversation, a very
Hmm.
mature conversation, which um, that probably has to be had in many circumstances in our life, not
Yeah.
just with aging parents, but with anything where we're over functioning.
Yeah. Or where you feel like you have to shoulder the whole responsibility of something when you don't.
Correct. And some of us may say, I don't know a way out of this. Well, but then you get help. You get help from someone, whether it's a pastor, a therapist, a counselor, because you're probably not objective enough, and you probably do have choices, and maybe they can help you see your choices so that you're not continuing to overfunction and burn out.
Right. Right. That's so good. I just, this self-awareness piece, one of the things I love, I just want to mention, but as we're wrapping this up today, in the workbook, you have this checklist, this inventory checklist
Mhm.
of how to know if you are an overfunctioner. And I was telling you earlier, and I'll tell our listeners so they won't feel bad if they do the assessment themselves. But there are 10 things. And I was a 7 the first time I did this. And that's kind of on the high end of the moderate overfunctioner. It's leaning towards the high overfunctioner. And so I want to go back and do this again at some point. And I think it's a good thing to go through in different seasons so I can see my own progress, right?
Right.
If I'm getting better at this. But just wanted to encourage folks, if you're not sure, you think you might be an overfunctioner, but you're not 100% sure, this checklist is so helpful because it just gets right to the heart of some of the symptoms of being an overfunctioner. And so I would highly recommend it as a way to start that journey, that you were talking about being able to get to that point of admission that we're doing it in the first place. We have to be self-aware. And it's a wonderful checklist.
Yeah. Now, have you become aware, Kathy, of the contexts in which you are most prone to overfunction?
Yes.
Because that's really important. That's become important to me. And so, for example, my context is special, especially with my family, because I am their mother, and I raised them. I did a lot for them, and you can just kind of stay on that continuum, right, of mothering and caring for them. But yet now they're adults; they don't need that same kind of. But and around family and around holidays. Oh, holidays.
I remember, I think we talked about on a previous podcast what you did this past Christmas of your sheet that you did, your kind of your PowerPoint, if you will, of how you were going to not allow yourself to overfunction and taking practical steps in preparation so that you wouldn't. I mean, that was brilliant.
And any event that I love doing events, but my big problem is I have overfunction a lot in the events, planning the events. So I have to be really careful about that. It's just a vulnerability for me.
Right.
And I don't want to end up resenting everybody and then you don't enjoy the event.
It totally robs you of your own enjoyment.
Right.
Well, this has been just a wonderful conversation. I know there's so many more examples we could talk about, and I'm confident this has resonated with many of our listeners right now, whether they're lower on the spectrum of overfunctioning or higher like me. But I definitely want to I think we're going to probably have this resource available, this checklist at some point, but in the interim, you can certainly get it in the workbook, and would encourage folks to pick up the book and the accompanying workbook, because the tools are just so helpful. Any last thoughts you want to leave us with, Geri, today on this topic?
As we continue through the book, one thing I would really invite listeners to pay attention to is, in each one, we have usually a context which we are most vulnerable. So, for example, quit lying. Well, who is it that you are most tempted to lie to or not tell the whole truth to, and or in what situations? The same thing with blaming. Who are you most tempted to blame, or in what context do you maybe go to a default of blaming? Or even denying your anger, sadness, and fear. With whom are you most tempted to deny your anger or sadness or fear to? And in what context? And now, of course, overfunctioning. In what context am I most prone or vulnerable to start overfunctioning? So that's one thing I want to encourage listeners to, as we continue to go through this, in each one of these, with whom or in what situation are you most vulnerable with these areas?
That's fantastic. Yeah, I love the thinking through the context. That's great. Great advice. Thank you, Geri. This has been a wonderful conversation. And again, just to remind our listeners, you can pick up the book, Emotionally Healthy Woman, and the accompanying workbook, and get started on this incredible journey of quitting things. Thank you so much for this conversation today, Geri.
Okay, thank you.